When a unit can't form the bonds of trust that it needs, this is damaging operational effectiveness. It's really hard to encourage people to this amazing fighting force when you can't honestly say to the next generation of men and women, it's worth it, it's worth the sacrifice. You'll be really well looked after when you're serving and when you leave, because at the moment, a lot of us can't say that.
I'm Professor Matt Fossey and I'm the co-chair of the NATO Research Task Group on Sexual Violence in the Military. Research group on sexual violence was set up about 6 years ago to look at the challenges faced by different NATO countries with regard to sexual violence and sexual harassment within the military, and to try to come up with some principles for how we can actually manage and deal with those particular problems.
The immediate motivation, of course, is the negative consequences to the individuals involved. First, the victims, the impact on physical and mental health, very often leading to PTSD and even suicide attempt.
I don't think this is talked about enough with regards to MST victim survivors, but it's the moral injury, the sense of betrayal that comes with having been intimately violated by someone you would potentially go to war with, live with, and die for. That is an exceptional betrayal.
Combat Stress, in conjunction with the Women's Royal Army Corps, conducted the largest ever study dedicated at looking at the needs of women veterans in the UK. We recruited 750 women veterans from all across the UK, and the aim of the study was really to understand their health and well-being. As part of this, we also looked at what we term military sexual trauma. These are experiences of sexual harassment or assault during military service perpetrated by a member of the military. Unfortunately, we found really quite high rates. So about 1 in 4, or 25% of our sample, reported having been a victim of these terrible events during the military service.
All of the victim survivors we spoke to had really similar experiences of sexual violence in the military. So it was that sort of everyday nature of sexual harassment. A lot of the time it was perpetrated by senior personnel in higher ranks and almost trivialised and not seen as sexual offending. So our participants didn't feel that they could report, didn't know who they could report to, and there were really distinct barriers around feeling that they were being believed, feeling that something would be done if they did make that report. And I think sort of going down the line, their experiences with the service justice system highlighted a lot of challenges in terms of how victim survivors are treated, both within the service justice system and by the rest of the regiment once they've made a report. So a lot of the time they'd explain that they felt isolated, that they felt that no one would speak to them, and they were kind of blamed for tearing apart the regiment for making this complaint.
This behavior is not unique to the military. However, in the military there are certain factors that definitely contribute to it. For example, at the individual level, lots of young people. Age is certainly a risk factor. Disproportionately male environment. We have, for example, in Canada, 16% women. In UK, I think it's 13-14%. So those are similar percentages across NATO countries, and in some countries even less than that. Situationally, high-risk environment certainly, for example, deployment, operational deployment, we have found in our research that operational deployment is a risk factor. Alcohol use often seems to be contributing factors, and the research has shown that alcohol use in the military is quite prevalent. For NATO countries, it is really important that we have a common understanding of the behaviors that constitute sexual harassment, sexual violence. As many of our members, they serve together on joint NATO missions, and coming from different cultural backgrounds, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of having a common understanding of the behavior and how inappropriate these behaviors are. Another motivation certainly is many militaries are struggling to increase recruitment of women. And certainly this is an issue that is overly affecting women. And in order to do better on the recruitment side, we certainly need to do everything possible to reduce the instances of these inappropriate behaviors.
There's a range of NATO allies that are involved. So we have a diverse group of countries, including Germany, Sweden, Romania, UK, Canada. The countries that are involved provide specialists, scientists, policy people, and also service personnel that sit on the panels to help to inform the process.
Hrvatska vojska na svim svojim razinama aktivno podupire rezoluciju 1325, njoj srodnih rezolucija te NATO dokumenata vezanih uz pitanje rodne ravnopravnosti. Politike, smjernice i planovi koji se tiču ovog područja u potpori su Nacionalnog akcijskog plana Republike Hrvatske. Pitanje osviještenosti rodne ravnopravnosti u temeljima je Hrvatske vojske i uključeno je u nastavne programe na svim razinama vojnog školovanja i obuke, promovirajući načela jednakih mogućnosti, rodne ravnopravnosti i nulte tolerancije za sve oblike ugrožavanja, maltretiranja i nasilja.
I think the thing that was common to everybody was that all the nations that participated recognized that there was an issue with sexual violence within the military. We were all starting from an area where we wanted to make things better. It was clear that some nations had more money and more resource to throw at the problem and therefore had achieved a lot more. However, it was also clear that some of those nations that didn't have a lot of resource were looking at very innovative ways to try and address the problem.
Different NATO allies deal with military sexual harassment and sexual violence in very, very different ways. So what this means, unfortunately, is in some places, sexual violence is not necessarily recognised as a challenge within the militaries because they're not actually asking those questions or measuring sexual violence. What we're trying to do within the group is to develop mechanisms that are culturally sensitive, that can work across different NATO ally countries so that they can measure sexual harassment and sexual violence using sort of standard mechanisms.
Some of the recommendations included the importance of being on the same page, understanding what behaviors constitute inappropriate behavior. So definition, so the group worked together to develop a culturally sensitive definition of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And one of the recommendations is for NATO documents to adopt definition of these type of behaviors. As when we started, for example, we reviewed STANAG, so these are the documents when people are preparing to go and join NATO missions, kind of rules of engagement to ensure interoperability across nations. So there are technical documents, of course, to ensure that technically things work together, but of course, on the personnel side, we need to ensure that we work well together. So that's one of the proposals, to adopt definitions developed by the group and adopt them into NATO documents. The second one is to adopt and use this tool that we developed, culturally sensitive, psychometrically validated instrument to measure sexual harassment and sexual assault. Many countries don't have research and resources to develop and invest into developing something like this. So for us, it was important to make it available off the shelf, translated in 7 languages. So absolutely there to be used and adopted. And this instrument, it's not only to measure the incidences of these behaviors, but when you are measuring something like this, you are also raising awareness and understanding to the issue that you are measuring. And finally, another recommendation was also to invest resources into technology and scenario-based training. For the purpose of the group, we also developed certain scenarios to have as much as possible realistic scenarios and dilemmas to communicate the policies and brainstorm and to be used for the training purposes. Because at the end, the goal is really to eradicate this behavior across NATO militaries.
I think I'd make recommendations across the kind of different points. So I think when people join the military, both men and women, there needs to be better education about what behaviours are appropriate or aren't appropriate, and also support to enable people to engage in treatment or report inappropriate behaviours. And then I think more work needs to be done to build capacity across the mental health sector to understand how best to treat people, how best to ask questions about negative experiences during military service, and then what are the best treatments to offer people who then have experienced sexual trauma.
I certainly want my daughters to be able to go to work and feel safe in the work environment, whether it's working in a bank or whether it's working in a military environment. I think it's very, very important that the standards of safety are upheld in that military environment so people can actually operate at their optimum levels.
Yeah, I think it's really important to pool that NATO expertise, and we've got some really great people working within that NATO group on sexual violence who are tirelessly trying to make changes, and I think the more that we can pull together and collaborate as NATO countries to then disseminate this knowledge and to make sure individual militaries are working together on this and trying to stop sexual violence within militaries globally, I think that can only be a good thing.